So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Etienne Basso. I'm the Director of the Members Research Service at the EPRS, and I would like to welcome you for this book talk, which is the European Union and its citizens, EU funding, social investment, and human well-being. I'd like to welcome our guest speakers today is, of course, the author of the book, Lisa Dellmuth, Professor of International Relations at the University of Stockholm. She will be in conversation with Martijn Burger, Academic Director of ERO, Erasmus University of Rotterdam, and he's also Professor of Happiness Economics, looking forward, Open University of the Netherlands. And the discussion is going to be moderated by our visiting fellow, non-resident visiting fellow at the EPRS, Gabi Umbach, who is part-time professor at the European University Institute in Florence. We have 1.5 hours. I'd like also to welcome our audience online. Just like to say, as a bit of context, that in less than 15 months, we will have this big meeting with the European citizens, which is the European elections that are happening every 5 years. And it's extremely important to look at what role the European Union is playing towards the citizens, and to think about it and to reflect about it and to look at research that is related to the added value of the European Union towards the citizens. I'd like to say also from the point of view of the EPRS that we are working on various projects that are linked to citizens, notably this massive project that maybe some of you know, which is What Europe Does For Me, which tries to explain from the point of view not of the policymaker, but from the point of view of the beneficiaries of the policies, what the European Union has done on territories of the European Union, departments in France, Kreis in Germany, provinces in Italy, but also from the point of view of socio-economic groups, such as professions, such as people doing a particular hobby, such as people that have a particular family situation, and so on and so forth. So we are currently updating this massive project, and that's going to be put online later in the year. In addition to that, we are doing several research that are linked to citizens' expectations as a follow-up of Eurobarometer surveys. So that's going to keep us busy in the months to come. But today we are going to look at EU funding, social investment, and human well-being. Gabi is going to moderate this event, and we are very much looking forward to the discussion. Over to you, Gabi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Etienne, for the introduction, and Lisa, to you for agreeing to discuss your book, and Martijn, to you for adding to our discussion to be in conversation with Lisa later on. Starting today, I would like you to come with me joining the past. We are in October 22, at the end of the European Week of Regions and Cities. We are at a conference that is a side event, the Youth for Regions Conference. And Stefan de Keersmakers, the spokesperson for the EU Green Deal of the European Commission, says, cohesion is beautiful. At the conference sits Claudia Garignani, who's a member of this Youth for Regions network, and which is a network of young journalists engaged in regional affairs. And she's reflecting on her participation in this event. And she says, well, this speech of Mr. Keersmakers underlined two things: the relevance of importance to improve citizens' lives and the immediate impact on citizens' lives. And she said, well, yes, I was wondering, taking stock of what I had experienced during this week, I was taking stock and wondering, is that indeed the case? So can EU cohesion programs really impact lives? And is there a convergence in interests and ideas of EU institutions and the normal citizens? And what she said, her main piece of wisdom that she takes away is that knowledge is power, and even more so for regional policies. And that this is also a moral imperative to know more about cohesion policy, to make it more prominent and to make it more tangible for the normal EU citizen. She reflects then a bit on a an older piece of statistics of survey data from 2019, a flash barometer, and I've checked this up in 2021. In 2019, around about 40% of EU citizens knew about cohesion policy. It hasn't increased much, although a little, through the results of the impact of the pandemic and the mitigation through EU cohesion programs. So we are currently around 49% of EU citizens who say they have heard about cohesion instruments. If we then go into the concrete instruments, it becomes a bit more different, reaching even only 4% for some innovation tools. So here we are, knowing that citizens know little about cohesion policy, knowing that EU institutions value the programs a lot to increase Europeanization, to increase standards of living across the region. And we go back to Bo Rothstein's introduction to your book, Lisa, because he said what the book does is that it offers an evidence base for exactly the discussions we need to have on cohesion policy, on the impact of cohesion policy in between scientists, policymakers, and even more a broader range of citizens. So potentially at the end of our book talk, and now I take you in the future, at the end of our book talk, we are discussing how the EU could indeed improve cohesion policy to reach people's lives. And against all of this journey from the past into the future, Lisa, I'm wondering, what was your main motivation when you started your research to think, is that really a success story, or is that potentially a bit of a painful analysis that I will do on the success and impact of EU cohesion policy on the citizens' lives? Over to you.
Thanks so much, Etienne and Gabi, for these kind and interesting introductions. That gives us a lot of food for thought, which can stay with us during this presentation and ensuing discussion. And thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about this book. Yes, I will speak a little bit about my motivation and take a step back from public opinion and first talk more about EU regional policies and EU growth policies before I touch on the issue of public trust and public legitimacy beliefs toward the EU. So the background of this book and why I wrote it, the main purpose of the book is basically to bring in the issue of vulnerable people being left behind into the debate about the EU's growth policies. So in a way, this book speaks to the broader debate about the tension between the EU's competitiveness and growth policies on the one hand, versus the EU's arguably weaker market-correcting social policies on the other hand. And I started writing the book in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, 2007-2008. During the crisis, I had done a PhD at the University of Mannheim on the politics of regional spending and the allocation of these regional development funds in the EU. But in the aftermath of the crisis, I became more aware and also more interested in the effects of this spending on actual well-being of citizens. And it became clearer to me that there was an economic upswing after the crisis from 2012. Employment and incomes were on the rise, unemployment fell, and so on. But some regions and some people within these regions, they did not equally benefit from this upswing. So if we take a historical perspective, shares of people at risk of poverty fell in the EU on average in the 5 years after the economic crisis, 2013, 2018. But then there's always another part of the story as well, where shares of people at risk of poverty rose in some countries, like Estonia, the Netherlands, and Finland, among others. And gaps in this share between regions can be very high, especially in countries like Italy, Spain, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Germany. There are very different stories to be told about the regions and the gaps between them, but also people within these regions. And if you compare, for example, to take another historical interesting figure, measures of poverty, severe material deprivation, and at risk of poverty between 1995 and 2015, you can see that we have not make so much progress. We haven't made any progress in many EU countries. Take, for example, again, the Netherlands, Germany, but also the UK, Italy, Greece, Spain, and so on. And so against this background, a related, even broader development is that in recent decades, our passive welfare states have been transformed into those so-called social investment states. And there has been an increasing focus on social investment, active labor market policies, and social inclusion, and so on. And this is also reflected, as I touch on in the book, this is also reflected in the EU's place-based regional policies. So these compensation payments through the European structural investment funds and the cohesion funds. But even still, some people are left behind. And we also see that people are still and have historically been divided over the legitimacy of the EU. Average trust in the EU, for example, fell between 2007 and 2012 and has risen in the years of economic recovery. But we do see increasing evidence, and I think this will also be something that we will return to in this discussion. What we also see is increased evidence that people in the lagging regions that have been suffering from long-term structural decline, they are more prone to vote for anti-system and anti-EU parties. So inspired by this tension between EU growth and the poverty/inequality standstill, I've written this book, and it asks what effects has EU spending actually had on citizen well-being in EU regions before and after the global financial crisis, 2007-2008. And interestingly, the existing literature on EU spending effects in political economics has mostly focused on GDP growth and economic conversion effects. And there are very few studies on effects on employment and unemployment. And there, so far, I would argue, no studies focusing on spending effects on the distribution of wealth. And that is what I would like to add with this book. So let me switch on my presentation to tell you a bit more specifically about the central contributions of the book. So at the heart of this book is really the concept of regional well-being. This is a concept that I would like to put forward and suggest that it could be useful in the debate. Regional well-being refers to the just distribution of welfare, which increases the capabilities of poor and otherwise vulnerable people. And what I do in the book is to discuss it against the backdrop of the predominant concept of regional development. And so the problem revolves around the observation that enhancing well-being is a central EU goal, but the EU's collective problem solving is deeply challenged given persistent poverty and inequality problems. So the book asks how, when, and why do EU regional funding programs enhance regional well-being? And the central contributions, before I go into them in more depth, are that first I conceptualize this notion of regional well-being as distributive justice. Second, I argue that regional development ought to be understood in terms of the distribution of welfare, not only in terms of welfare increases. Third, I map intra-regional well-being in 189 regions in 16 EU member states from 1994 to 2013. And fourth, I analyze EU regional funding effects on inter-regional well-being, and I discuss the barriers to successful funding, which I think is a discussion that maybe we could take up and turn into a constructive discussion about what could be made better. So the spending patterns that I cover in the book are following. I cover the EU structural and investment funds and the cohesion funds, and these are the spending patterns that I look at. You can see the time period that the book encompasses, and you can see that I distinguish between economic and social funding. And you can see that the economic funds are larger in amounts, and that in, relative to GDP per capita, they have also increased in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, whereas the social funds, they have sharply increased after Lisbon, after 2000, but then during 2007 to 2013, they have decreased again. So those are the spending patterns. And starting from that, I engage in this comparative analysis across the subnational regions at NUTS 1 and NUTS 2 level in the 16 new member states. And I employ a variety of methods that I'm happy to discuss during the Q&A, but that I perhaps don't have to elaborate on so much now. I do an econometric analysis of panel data taken from the ECHP and EU Silk household data series. And I have also relied on 156 standardized interviews with civil servants in 19 countries and 33 in-depth interviews with EU policymakers and an analysis of various regional policy documents. So it's a very varied evidence base, which I have wanted to do in order to be able to take an encompassing view on this very complex topic. So from that evidence base, there are the following key messages that emerge from the book. And the first is that, and I think this also reflects previous literature and ongoing research on EU regional effects on employment growth and unemployment rates, there is a measurable effect of EU regional development funding on employment and on unemployment. So employment and unemployment are two of the measures that I use to measure capabilities in EU regions, along with youth inactivity and health. And both for economic and social investment, you can see these employment effects. For social investment, only in the rich regions, but economic investment also, maybe not surprisingly, it's also larger in amounts, and it is allocated in terms of more efficient capital subsidies to firms for example, vocational training or other types of investment and employment programs. So you can find those effects. But the book takes one step further, and it also focuses on those measures of regional well-being that I put forward as distributive justice measures. And those are poverty and income inequality measures, mostly. And I look at different types of income inequality measures, so that are sensitive to different movements in the distribution of income within a society. And here we can find either no effects or adverse effects. And so for economic investment, no effects are found, but for social investment, on most indicators, no effects can be found. But in the poor regions, you can find measurable adverse effects on income inequality. So despite there being employment growth effects of social investment, you can see that social investment has adverse negative effects and exacerbates income inequality in the poor regions. And this is, of course, not an isolated finding, but it also ties on with other ongoing work in this area that I've become aware of, that also works with EU-level household data, and that also kind of finds that there are these adverse effects on income inequality. And this is in part because, and I will talk about that a little bit more now, why that is, but mainly because those social investment funding flows benefit the already rich and well-skilled households and firms. And this brings me to the structural barriers that the book finds that there are to well-being effects of the EU regional development funds. The first is that social and economic investments remain largely siloed. There has been a continuous mainstreaming of social goals into the EU social investment funds, structural investment funds, since the end of the 1990s. And I think in the 1990s, we could really see that this debate about social Europe and mainstreaming of social goals has gained momentum. And in Lisbon, there was this powerful energy to really bring in social goals, social inclusion, combating poverty, increasingly also awareness of gender inequality and so on. But in practice, and this is something that the book has looked at in detail, also in case studies, we do not see that these social goals have been mainstreamed into the practice in the member states when the funding is reallocated after the first shares have been earmarked. So this is what I mean with that these investment types remain largely siloed. And also, as you've seen on one of the previous slides, social funding amounts continue to be small. So this is a very straightforward reason for why this spending type cannot have strong and powerful effects. And third, these small amounts are spread thinly into richer areas. And while that is arguably the case also for other types of structural and investment funding, the issue here is that these Matthew effects, which is a common term in social policy research, which basically means that the rich benefit more from active labor market programs and social investment programs, because those mainly benefits the already skilled and educated and richer households. That is an issue here because it can be linked to those adverse effects on income inequality, especially in the poorer regions. And fourth, and that ties nicely back to Gabi's initial story, is that informational asymmetries persist, and they are really persistent. People in the poorer regions and in poorer areas and rich regions, they oftentimes don't have the capacity to look up the latest changes in EU regional funding. They may not have the networks or the know-how on how to connect to the relevant ministries and promote and marketize their ideas and projects. So what happens oftentimes is that that already known and rich actors and resource-rich actors in the regions that they get big shares of the regional funds. And finally, there are simply shortfalls in administrative capacity in the poor regions. We all know that, and they undermine the ability of resource-poor actors to attract EU funding. That is kind of linked to the previous point, but I think it's worth re-emphasizing because not all of the different, not all of these reasons can be traced back to the EU, but they're of course also structural realities in the regions that are met and that can kind of be barriers to effective well-being effects of the regional funds. So those were the findings of the book, and with these findings I would like to emphasize three broader implications that perhaps we can come back to in the discussion later on. And the first is the implication for inclusive growth. I mean, I think without a focus on and an integrated strategy and integrated practices on this issue, we're unlikely to see positive effects on well-being. This is a broad, complex, and complicated issue, but I think it's worth having a broader debate on it. And that is also tied to the second point on EU legitimacy. These well-being problems, they help us to understand why populist politicians might find it profitable to target the EU. As I indicated in the beginning, there's this increasing literature that gives insight into voting patterns and public support for the EU in the poorer regions versus the richer regions, but also in regions that have faced long-term structural decline versus those that have not seen this dramatic long-term decline. And we can see that there's some mixed evidence that in poorer regions, people tend to vote for anti-system parties and anti-globalist parties, but definitely you can see this effect in regions that have suffered from long-term structural decline. And third, and this is something that I hope we can also discuss a bit today, the book raises questions about broader EU regional and social spending reform, how we can make the spending better and how we can avoid unintended consequences of EU regional funding. Yeah, thank you so much. This was the presentation for now. And I would like to hand it back to our chair.
Super, great. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for talking us through your motivation, but also the substance of the book. And you mentioned that several times as a key year, 2000, with the Lisbon strategy. Indeed, you know, the discussion in the run-up of EMU, what type of stabilizers can we bring in, given that we don't have a fully fledged union in that regard to support. We had then the European employment strategy attached to it, high hopes of that functioning as such a stabilizer. And all the groups, you know, the aunts, the relatives of the open method of coordination and pension, social inclusion, what have you. It seems that the fears of DG, so economic and financial affairs and employment not being really on the same level of discussion and policy impact seem to shine through in your results, actually, that we see social spending still to a lesser degree relevant and impacting than the economic spending part. But you also underlined the systemic impact that this has, knock-on effects on trust in politics and on stability of the political system. Something looming there that I hope we can discuss later on is also the idea of the EU's economic growth model, whether or not this still holds and stands as the key paradigm for the future. And with that, Martijn, I'm very curious for your reflections on the book before, and that's a footnote to the audience. We will also come back to your questions that you please raise in the Q&A in the chat function. Martijn, over to you.
Thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me and discussing this wonderful book. As I will also outline in my discussion, I think it's a very necessary book and also very important, not only to read, but also to act upon. So policymakers here, please do so. Look at the advice that's also given in the book. Let me share my screen with you and the presentation. You can see my presentation?
Perfectly, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So my discussion is basically consists of three parts. So first of all, I would like to briefly discuss the main highlights of this book, according to me. And then I would like to place the book a little bit in a broader perspective. So in which broader discussion does the book fit very well. And at the end, I will give some extensions that are possible based on the research that has been conducted, particularly from a well-being perspective. So what is the book about is mainly like the title says, is Europe good for you? So you can say that the procurement of well-being is a central aspiration of the European Union. The Council of the European Union also said so. But like it's also been motivated in the book by Lisa, GDP growth has been the main instrument to procure this greater well-being. And then you can question whether economic growth in itself is sufficient to warrant a sustainable and inclusive well-being. And yeah, it is also shown by various metrics in the book that it is not the case. And GDP growth has also been slowing down for a while and comes also with some environmental and social costs, which are also asymmetrically distributed in the population. The poor suffer more from these environmental and social costs than the rich. So you can look at GDP as like main metric, but then you're not well informed about like the actual well-being in regions. And that has been, this proposition has been put forward by several, I think, fields. In my field of happiness studies, we look at subjective well-being, but also so the literatures that look at broad welfare, also the social, the SAG indicators by the European Union and the OECD also argue that you need to look at more than just GDP to measure the well-being of a region or a country. So a key message of the book in that regard is also that you must look beyond the regional GDP as an indicator for regional well-being, And the book proposes the regional well-being as distributive justice. So Lisa already provided the definition, the conditions through which poor and otherwise vulnerable people are provided with the capabilities to achieve a good quality of life. And this good quality of life is, I think, central in the thinking of well-being. Then the question is still, what is a good quality of life? But I think that we should all start thinking from the notion that GDP or income is just a means to achieve a good quality of life, but perhaps not good quality of life in itself. And in the book, various measures are introduced also that constitute this good quality of life. The capabilities, measures related to distributive justice. And what the book then also notes is that despite the EU has been good for GDP growth, social investment in Europe only like a weak effect on regional well-being. We saw and we see an effect on employment, but not, for example, on the distributive justice, and sometimes even an adverse effect of these investments. And particularly striking is that in poorer regions, this effect of social investments has been weak, despite promises of more inclusive growth and also this convergence that has been part and parcel of EU policy. What the book then does, and that is what I really like about it, is that there are several barriers to improve regional well-being, and authorities tend to focus also on projects that maximize their own interest. And Lisa identifies specific barriers why these social investments have not reached their envisioned effect. I won't go into detail there since Lisa explained it very well. But I think it's important again to stress that the lack of investments undermines the trust in the European Union. And then the big question is that we have to answer all together. How can we turn the tide? So it's not only about what is done in terms of investment, but also the implementation clearly plays a role in explaining why the investments do not reach the envisioned effects. So for me, also a personal highlight of the book is that there is a much needed call to look in a different way in what well-being is and how progress should be measured. But what the book convincingly does is provide a rigorous analysis of how EU investments affect or not affect regional well-being, using a mix of methods, and then also providing the valuable insights and reasons why these investments have derailed or did not reach the effect that was envisioned. And this is not only related to what has been done in terms of investments, but it's also very much related to the quality of policy implementation on the one hand, and also institutional quality perhaps on the other hand. And qualitative interviews in the book also provide here the much needed deepening. Then how can we see this book in a broader perspective? And there has been a lot of discussion about inequality and uneven growth in economics, political science, but even psychology and sociology. And this book is very timely and important. There has been the works of Piketty, there has been work by World Bank on this issue, so that there are the winners and losers of the globalization, or you can also put it the last 30, 40 years of economic growth that has been tremendous. What you see here is what we call the elephant graph, probably well known to some of you. This is the period 1988-2008, but for until 2018, you will see the same picture. And then you see the winners and the losers of globalization. And a lot of the losers are actually found in the Western societies. And that is corresponds with what also the book finds. So if you see the winners of the globalization wave and the tremendous world economic growth, it are the middle classes in emerging economies like China and India. it are the very rich in the Western societies. But if you look at the ones who hardly gained from the last globalization wave, then you see that there are the middle classes and the poor, the lower middle classes in Western societies, and the very poor in sub-Saharan Africa. And this like uneven profiting from economic growth has like reached to a point in which like the social contract that citizens have with their national governments, but also with the EU, are under pressure or bending. And you see that also in increasing social unrest, but also increasing voting for the more extreme left-wing and right-wing parties. And that is also like part of the background on which this book is constituted. Like what we see in Western societies is that the Washington consensus that we had with each other. So there's trade liberalization, of which is like EU enlargement is also like part of this wave, and went hand in hand with pro-sport spending and cheaper consumption opportunities. This Washington consensus is like failing or not living up to the expectations of especially the middle and lower classes. And so the whole idea between the consensus was we have like enlarging of markets, we have more free trade in exchange of like increasing consumption opportunities or redistribution, pro-poor spending. So it was a trade-off between enlarging market and cheapen the value of labor. That is precisely the thing that many EU or poorer EU citizens have to offer, but did not really enhance the quality of life through the better consumption opportunities. And like you see that also back in the weak effect of the social investments. And what we also perhaps learned from this book in that sense is that despite that there were these social investments did not really help like to counteract this movement. And it's a dangerous movement. And that is perhaps best depicted by the tunnel effect of Alfred Hirschman, economist who wrote this work in the 1970s. And the tunnel effect is basically about the parable of being stuck in front of a tunnel. And there are two lanes, and with both lanes headed in the same direction. All traffic is jammed, and as far as you can see, there is a traffic jam. And suddenly, like one lane starts to move. That's the movement in the 1980s. There's like strong economic growth. And like you are still stuck in that other lane, but you feel that things are going to be better. And that gives some kind of hope. But after waiting at a standstill for some time and watching the other lane moving, your feelings change. You also want to move, and you become gradually envious and furious. You and others are stuck and maybe suspect foul play, that the game is rigged, that the rules of the game, so like institutional economists put it, are not fair. And you maybe start to move and do things that are illegal. For example, crossing the double line. And this is also like a parable that we are seeing in economic times in which we live. We are driving in a tunnel, and some are driving and others are stuck. And the question is of the optimism of the prospect of progress for those who are stuck will turn into anger or feeling in the end left behind. And it also signifies that inclusive growth is also necessary in the end. And that is also like what the definition of regional well-being that Lisa provides is an important one. So it's that all nations need to promote in the end. And also like institutions are needed to make this type of growth happen. In the end, like everyone needs to not only like have the prospect that he or she will profit from that economic growth, but also experience and feel it, that life is getting better, so that quality of life is improving. And if it is not like the case, like it gradually undermines trust. There's the prospect that things will be getting better, but if things are not get better, then it undermines trust, not only in the EU, but also in national governments, and that we consistently see also back some countries more than in other countries. But if we look at Eurobarometer statistics, the trend is downward sloping. You also see it in, as I said, an increase in non-violent protests, and you also see it in the rise of right-wing and populist parties that also profit from this narrative, but also you can also see that somehow maybe they have a point in the sense that the citizens also feel that they have not been profiting enough from the economic growth, and that is also going to like only a small part of the population. And you see that also back in polarization statistics. So also polarization is something that seems to be largely different by perceptions. So the different interpretation of objective circumstances, in this case economic growth, differently interpreted by different groups because different groups experience economic growth differently. If we go then to like possible extensions to the work, then a natural extension is also to link like what we have seen in the work of Lisa to things like social unrest or voting behavior of European citizens. What I would also be interesting in, because the book focuses particularly on the poor, how it particularly takes the viewpoint that social investment should focus on the poorest and the least well off. But then it's also a question about the middle classes that you see are in some countries under pressure. You see that the middle classes are declining. And one question that I have, maybe we can address that in this discussion, is whether distributive justice measures should also take more explicitly into account the middle classes through the inclusion of different type of measures. Also because in some countries we see that the deprivation of the middle class also plays a role in the social unrest and polarization in societies. Another extension that might be interesting is looking at the definition of regional well-being. So like studying subjective well-being, I realized that you have to somewhere delimit how you measure regional well-being. But I think if you look at more regional well-being, it goes further than just the capabilities and distributive justice measures. So if you would look at overviews, then you would see that there are many phases of well-being or regional well-being, where you can look both at life chances and life outcomes, and the quality or the well-being can lay in the environment, or the well-being can be a result or can be a result of the inner qualities of life, so to call. So what the book of Lisa is doing is taking many outer and inner qualities into account. So it's GDP and many of the capabilities, distributive justice, also inequality is in, but it focuses mostly on the life chances, and we are also interested from a well-being perspective on how life chances translate in the appreciation of life, as studied by happiness economists. So whether people are able on the one hand to live a long life, and on the other hand to lead a happy life. And you can also look here at the inequality in subjective well-being within regions. Apart from that, the regional well-being approach as presented in the book focuses mostly on distributive justice and capabilities, but there are other aspects of the livability of the environment that you can take into account also when you look at policy making. You can, for example, look at environmental quality. You can take in more aspects of social structure, social cohesion, but you can also take in an aspect such as safety. Like I said, you look at a broad definition of welfare, so there are many aspects of the environment or livability of a person that you can take into account, but you can take more dimensions of well-being into account when focusing on policy making, and it is also there to discover how these different aspects of the livability of the environment and the livability of persons affect also how we experience life, so our happiness or life satisfaction. And that does not necessarily have to conflict with each other, because also in the well-being or the happiness literature, we see this lack of development of subjective well-being, known as the Easterlin paradox, which is not only cannot only be attributed to human behavior like adaptation or social comparison, but can also be attributed, at least in part, to the fact that wealth is very unequally distributed, but also to the fact that despite the economy has been growing, the world did not deal with other type of problems. So like a high GDP growth has gone hand in hand with a decline in the quality of social relationships, decline in feelings of safety, may have more stress at work, and larger environmental pollution. And there are trade-offs here. So also all the well-being movements are not saying that focusing on GDP growth is necessarily bad, but you should look at on how GDP is or income is generated, and that income is just one of the elements that makes up a good quality of life, but it's not the only element. And in that sense, their modern economics has perhaps gone a little bit wrong, and we should go back to, I would say, Adam Smith. So where modern economies tend to equate well-being with more consumption, higher GDP, Adam Smith, like a classical economist, said that income is part or a means for a good quality of life, but it's a means and not a goal in itself. The eventual goal is a good quality of life. He even uses the word happiness, although he defines it a little bit different than we do nowadays. And in that sense, the creation of a higher GDP should not come at the cost of other factors that are important for our well-being. And also taking in that some groups may benefit more from higher GDP than other groups. And in that sense, we should perhaps also in policy focus more on the question like not how can we generate more GDP, but also under which circumstances does a higher GDP or more wealth result in more happiness, or let's call it higher well-being, quality of life. And yeah, in this regard, given that also some groups might benefit more, these investments and distribution from the EU can also help as long as they target like the more deprived groups, leaving a little bit in the middle, whether it should be only the poor or the poor and the middle classes. Here I would like to stop and hand the floor back.
Great, thanks a lot, Martijn. Super. Now we're back in the group. Thanks a lot, Martijn, for your comments on the book that actually already set the environment, if you so wish, in which we now discuss. What we've seen, and you touched upon that, is that the question of impact and outcome of spending programs, regional support spending programs of the European Union, go beyond actual economic impact. Lisa, that's what you in your data science aspect focus on, because you focus strongly on outcome variables, which is a bit different from input models that show how states finance-wise support institution building and support policies, but you focus more on, yeah, but what type of impact does it really have? What outcome has the policy? And Martijn, you are touching upon questions that I want to push you now a bit in the first question that I want to ping pong between the two of you into. So you say means ends debate, especially around GDP as the main aim of economic activities, but potentially the questions of how we define the intrinsic markers and the intrinsic value of our economic activity for well-being, for regional well-being, but also for subjective well-being, right? So this follows very much Amartya Sen approach, Lisa, that you also take in your perspective, that you also take in your book with the capabilities approach, looking into rather what GDP can do for improving the subjective well-being of people, rather than how people can contribute to increasing GDP. Against this backdrop, I think some conceptual fieldwork is good here. And I want to push you a bit to your ideas on social sustainability within the EU. First of all, do we have something as like a definition for that within the EU? Do we know what we understand as social sustainability? And if so, do the spending programs, the regional spending programs, deliver on such a definition? So where are elements, Lisa, that you say, yes, they are successful in supporting social sustainability within the EU, or where are main aspects that are completely dysfunctional for that? Lisa.
Thanks so much for handing me back the word with such interesting questions. And thank you so much, Martijn, for your presentation and constructive discussion of the book. That's really greatly appreciated. And I agree that you really touched on the most important parts and also put this into a broader perspective of globalization and objective versus subjective well-being. I think that was very useful. And if I may, Gabi, before I touch on your question on social sustainability and EU's growth policies, may I just give a few reactions to the discussion?
Totally.
Super. So one thing that I wanted to take up that I think is really worth highlighting is Martijn mentioned that there's something going on with the middle classes and poverty and inequality in the rich areas of the EU. And the middle classes have basically suffered from increased. They perceive that their well-being decreases, be that correct or incorrect, and we see that in the rich areas of the EU, and that's also something that the book shows, and that of course mirrors also the OECD reports that shows trajectories in poverty and inequality in rich versus poor regions and urban versus rural areas, and that in the urban areas we tend to have greater, not in all, but we tend to have greater shares of inequality, and we have the phenomenon of the urban poor and so on, and the middle classes in these areas might perceive particularly that their social benefits and their social status is threatened, sort of. And in the book, I actually show that the EU spending effects, these adverse effects on income inequality in the poor regions, they're especially found on those inequality measures that are sensitive to the changes in the middle of the income distribution. So, for example, the Gini coefficient or the square coefficient of variation. But I do not find these effects on inequality measures that are more sensitive to changes at the top and the bottom of the income distribution. So, for example, that the richest 10% in European society becomes richer due to increased capital investments, something that Piketty has stressed in his publications. Is not something that I find in this book, but it is about the changes in the middle of the income distribution. So it is something about the middle classes here. I also think that again, economic conditions might be improving, and they have improved after 2012 in the aftermath of the crisis, but people might not perceive this. So indeed, links to subjective well-being have not been studied so much, and I agree that they ought to be systematically studied, because objective and subjective well-being have very different sources. And in the book, I study objective well-being only, and what I do is to use household level data, for example, on health and income, and I aggregate these data to the regional level.
If I may react to that very briefly, that's a very interesting remark also. And it also makes me increasingly question the GDP per capita as like an income measure. So because it doesn't take into account like the inequality in a society. So if you look, for example, at like median household income, then you see that it has been quite, if you correct it for inflation, it has been quite flat from the 1970s onwards in many Western societies. So that is also because we focus so much on the GDP per capita and people think it's going better, but like and they don't experience so. Maybe we are also using the wrong metric for like how well it's going with the population in a country.
Yeah, exactly, I really agree, and I also think that how we measure growth and progress and that also links to your presentation, Martijn, and how we tell it to people that also matters for public trust. I mean, another figure that's really striking, I think, is that when you look at support for political parties opposed to EU integration, and that has really increased from say 2000 onwards. So in 2000, for example, 15%, the share of parties opposing the EU was 15%. In 2018, it was already 25%. But when did this share really increase? It was in 2012, when actually economic conditions have begun to be better. And so that further underlines that people might not be on board. They might not perceive that they get a fair share of the welfare increases. And in part, it is, of course, due to the member states. They need to change communication, and also the EU needs to change its communication. So there is much to be done. It's easier said than done, but I think the communication strategy of what the EU adds to the picture needs to change radically. But also, we need to define the value of growth for well-being and tell to people what the vision of growth is. And I'm wondering if, I think when I look at the EU's social sustainability model or conception that you talked about, Gabi, I think that it's very much fragmented or kind of added onto each other. They're the growth and competitiveness enhancing strategies. And then there are aspects related to poverty reduction and social exclusion. But those strategies, they have historically not connected very well. And in part, that is, of course, because member states are very reluctant to delegate authority to the EU in the area of social policy. But even still, rhetorically and in the regulations, as I show in the book, these sort of social sustainability goals, they have been integrated into the growth enhancing policies, and without success when you measure it in terms of regional well-being increases. So the question is if that is the right way to go, and if we may need to rethink the EU's growth model, and how that can translate into changes in existing funding instruments, or perhaps the setup of new instruments. And I mean, recently, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that new instruments have been created, and some with a considerable success, arguably, like SURE, for example, instruments that are not integrated in the structural and cohesion funds. And that could be part of the debate as well, if perhaps it's not possible to link the EU's traditional growth-enhancing instruments really intrinsically in an integrated way to the social policies. If there's simply too many barriers for that, then perhaps new funding instruments are necessary that are based on a new kind of growth vision. But it's also worth the thought if growth policies could be rethought in the context of already existing funding instruments.
No, that's a very interesting remark. So if you would look at the subjective well-being literature, this would be completely in line with it, or at least would advocate for a different growth paradigm, because it would say, at least the empirical studies, like growth that is more equally distributed would lead to a greater subjective well-being. And growth that comes not at the cost of, does not like bear environmental and social costs. So does not go hand in hand with pollution, and does not go hand in hand with polarization or decrease of social cohesion in society. Those are the better types of growth. Then is of course the question, and that is I would like to ask you, Lita, since you're more the expert on it. Do we lack instruments, or is it more on the implementation side, in your opinion, that it goes wrong? So we have the instruments, but like we do not how to play the instruments.
Exactly. I think this is a good distinction between the regulations and the rhetoric in the public debate, and the aims of the regional development policies on the one hand, and then the implementation of the policies on the other hand. And of course, you and also our audience are familiar with the fact that the member states implement the funding policies, and that we have the principle of subsidiarity, and the member states have great leeway in using the regional development funds. And of course, there are targets, and now also, for example, climate policy targets have been added to the policy, and so on. A certain percentage of the funding needs to be relevant for decarbonization or adaptation. But 20% of the EU funds has historically been approximately dedicated to social funding. But the question is what the member states do with this, with these goals when they implement the funds. And what I find, and this of course differs in different member states, but one recurrent pattern is that that the member states need to make sure that they absorb this funding, and that gives great incentive to give the funding to partners that are relatively well experienced, and that are already resource rich, and that are known to be able to use the funds. And sometimes funding is also used for social goals that are obviously not really conducive to helping the poor and marginalized groups in society. So for example, local projects like giving funds to NGOs that try to help migrants or women or other vulnerable groups to come into the labor market. Such types of funding are relatively rarely seen. And I also understand that this is the case because the funding need to be absorbed, and you need to have reliable partners that use the funds for good purposes. So it's kind of inbuilt into EU regional development funding that these funds have to be used, and they have to be used well, and they have to be used in a measurable way. And that undermines to use these funds for actors that want to help poor and marginalized people, or the long-term unemployed, for example. And another example is the health funding that oftentimes goes into health infrastructure and health facilities. And of course, that is also important. And poor services, health services in regions have also been linked to lower well-being. But it's not enough to show measurable effects on well-being. And even worse, right? The book shows that there are negative effects in poor regions, namely on income inequality, because the EU funding helps those that are already quite well skilled and well educated. So I mean, against this backdrop, I mean, I have more questions to politics than I have answers, but I think the core question is if this instrument of the regional development funds is fit for purpose. I mean, radically, there could be two paths. The one could be to cut out the social goals almost entirely out of the European structural investment funds and the cohesion funds, and to be and be fair and say that this cannot be integrated. And in terms of crisis, also as we have seen with Next Generation EU and the use of structural funds to help member states overcome the economic downturn due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the social funds have really taken a back seat. Funds have not been used and did not have to be used for social purposes under the structural investment funds. So perhaps it's not possible. So that could be a radical pathway, and the answer could be to create a new funding scheme that is more focused on social Europe and that is more forceful than previous smaller social funds have been.
Yeah, great. Can I just point you at something? Thank you very much for this discussion so far, because all of that for me, translating in my brain, pushes us into one essential question. We have talked a lot about equality and inequality as the main issue of structural funding to be a target to be solved, right? What comes now through in your discussion, vulnerable groups, pro-poor spending, positive impact on richer regions, even on richer shares of income distribution groups, right? Isn't a move, so I find the idea very interesting to, let's say, outsource the social questions, be it flow, stock or buffer, so activation policies, healthcare in the buffer, and the labor market policies of human capital development, lifelong learning, outsource them into a completely new program. Why not focus such a program on equity, micro-targeting, microfinances? So to make this really a program where citizens have a say in how to spend, are giving smaller shares for smaller projects to raise community building from below, and to increase the visibility of the EU in everybody's life. Is that cornucopia? Is that a bit unicorn approach, or could that be a feasible approach?
I think this is most interesting, and I would also love to hear Martijn's impressions of
well, like
any literature on
I know that in the subjective well-being literature, I don't know whether it has been a real experiment, but at least it has been a thought experiment where there has also been a discussion like, for example, nobody liked taxes or getting taxes, but it's something like or paying taxes. But you can make also paying taxes like more, well, in that sense, less saddening if you let, for example, citizens have a say in how taxes are spent. So what this literature is also stressing, it's not only on what you do as a government, because I think taxes are somewhere a necessary evil for some people, because like we need to maintain a good quality of life in society, and some things are better organized when the government does it than when private parties do it. But then if you have citizens and say in how money is spent, you become also like more transparent. People also have the feeling that they pay for something that is meaningful, and perhaps they even feel themselves being a good citizen because like it becomes more explicit. The same is for thanking people for paying taxes, and governments can do a much better job, and maybe the key in general is also a better interaction between the government and its citizens. The government has become something very distant, and like at the higher level. So at the local level, especially the smaller municipalities, like people still have contact with their government, but national and EU governments are something very distant and something very invisible for most citizens. So if you like manage as even like EU to come closer to the citizens by programs like this, like I think it would help at least also to build up trust. It will take years because like we have a saying, at least in Dutch, like it trust comes by foot and it disappears by horse. So it's not an English saying, but yeah.
Let me take up that thought to get back to Gabi's suggestion about the small scale democratic experiments that we could try with bottom up funding. I think it's a great idea, and it ties in with ongoing debates in the EU. I think about how the democratic governance of the EU could be strengthened, and how democratic practices can be maintained in managing ongoing social and environmental and economic challenges. So in that sense, I think that would be a very good suggestion. And I also think that when we speak of trust building in societies, we know that Elinor Ostrom and the research agenda in political economics based on her work has really shown us that the trust is best built in small scale communication settings and not in large scale communication settings. And we also know that the EU's communication, understandably, but it is a fact, it is quite technical. It's focused on the assisting the member states in overcoming political problems. So it's depoliticized and it's very technical. And it doesn't help to increase trust in the organization. But what increases trust in the EU is in part trust in people and trust in national government and political parties. All of those trust, individually held trust beliefs are positively correlated. So trust in the EU in parts depends on trust also in other people, not only in close family or friends, but also people that we might not know so well and that we choose to rely on. And this kind of trust could indeed be built in small scale communication settings like fora for discussing funding measures and I'm not an expert on this, but I have heard that there are local initiatives in Sweden, for example, that are citizen-based, based on principles of deliberative democracy, to assist local governments in climate-related decision-making. So there are current projects, and I think these have reoccurred in political history, so we wouldn't have to start from scratch. But indeed, such local councils or fora might help to assist the EU. That said, I don't think that. I mean, we also know that marginalization and social exclusion, long-term unemployment also correlates with lower self-efficacy and lower political participation, in part because people don't really feel that they can make a difference. And this is part of the structures that I would like to see the EU to help the member states break up more forcefully. But I don't think local councils would help, because it is exactly those people that we would seek to help that would also be excluded from such initiatives. That said, there might be powerful local civil society representatives that one could work with. So in sum, I think that's a very innovative and interesting thought.
If we take that a step further and tie it to the capability approach and especially the Human Development Report, right, with the idea of human-centered development. If you look into the past of the regional programs, regional funding programs, with the functional and dysfunctional parts of that, would there be any lock-in where you think such a human-centered approach rather than a big project-centered approach giving it to, as you said, giving it to firms for lifelong learning, for educational efforts, attributing that to people who then can invest in themselves? Is there a logic that would link it to the present practice of the regional programs, or is this completely a different alien beast to be implemented there?
What you suggest here, I think, links more to instruments such as microcredits to very small scale enterprises, even one-man enterprises, or individual efforts rather than structural funds. I don't think that such a logic has dominated the allocation of EU regional funds. I think it's always has been project-based. And the logic has been more place-based and focused on growth and competitiveness from the start than it has been in more recent years. So we have actually seen this turn toward focusing on individual citizens and marginalization and social exclusion and poverty, or even at risk of poverty, and gender inequality. We have seen this rhetorical turn, especially in the late 1990s, but it has not really translated into, structurally different funding practices. So I don't think we can see such a turn. I think the funding has always been and is still project-based, despite the public debate about bringing in the social and linking social and regional policies. And also now in recent years, I see that this debate has not gained momentum, even if many people have lost their jobs. And we have seen a broader economic downturn due to COVID-19. But rather, the debate seems to have been stymied, I would argue, which also says something about our like a deep-seated conviction in European society that we ought to care about growth and competitiveness. But the evidence is abundant and is increasing that there's a phenomenon such as place-based political discontent, and I keep getting back to that because it is really an imperative, and it will not leave the debate, but it will rather become stronger. Also with the growing proliferation of the academic debate on public discontent and how that links to the structural characteristics of our regions. So there's something in this regional place-based logic and the allocation to places that can be linked to well-being and public discontent. But we need more research on that. But we certainly also need not only a broader debate, but also tests of the kinds that you mentioned, Gabi, about small-scale local fora or councils or something like that, or small-scale funding schemes, which potentially could be scaled up to larger amounts in order to test what is possible.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. Do we have examples from other constituencies around the world where such things work potentially in view of implementing ODA, so official development assistant donor money on the ground
Not that I know. Like I'm only familiar with like one or two case studies that have examined this. No, there's still, like, if you look at governments and policy, and also like thinking what is good for citizens, it has been mostly top-down approaches and not so much bottom-up in that regard.
I do have the feeling
but
we
I
do have a bit of an issue there. Yeah, please.
Oh, my apologies,
exactly
Gabi. I was just thinking that I'm a bit familiar with the debate about the allocation of humanitarian aid, and not development aid, but humanitarian aid. And I mean, oftentimes a general approach is, of course, that donors work, both the bilateral and multilateral donors work with local civil society. So I mean, I think perhaps, I mean, as Martijn says, there's no specific evidence on such projects, but this larger debate might give some inspiration.
On how to redesign with a view to 2028, 2034, the new program line. While we discuss, I again encourage civil participation also here, the audience to raise their questions. If we look into, and this is potentially the big area in which we conclude, because it's also productive, I assume, to discuss that. If we looked into the reform, so into the next program, spending program from 2028 to 34, Lisa, what are the most functional and potentially dysfunctional elements of current regional funding and current cohesion spending that you would advise policymakers to really take a look at and let change breathe through the ideas of the new program? What would your main advice be in this regard?
This is a very difficult question because some of the practices that are important and that have a good rationale, they can have unintended consequences. So, for example, that knowledge is power, that the spending goes to already knowledgeable, well-skilled and known partners of, for example, managing authorities. That is, of course, done to spend the money and to spend it well. I mean, we all know there is a certain very low percentage of the funding that goes wrong, and maybe there may even be fraud. It's a very low percentage, and I mean, in part that is due to the fact that our historical GROW network works with funding partners in the regions. But at the same time, this also means that the poorest areas and perhaps those with innovative ideas might not be heard and might not be part of the funding policies. And I think that has to change, because we see that something is going wrong. So despite the good intentions, I think, and there are myriads of case studies from different EU member states that show that there are these strong networks, and I think it would be very important to strengthen more bottom-up approaches, to bring in projects that are closer to people's pocketbooks and also minds, because at present most of the regional funds are allocated in terms of capital subsidies to firms. That it's good to get rid of the money, if I may say that so, in that way, but it does not get through to people. Also, to get back to one of the interesting figures that you mentioned in the beginning, Gabi, that in 2021 and another measurement in 2018, I think, from the Flash Eurobarometers, 40% of the people knew about the regional funding. In 2008, I remember having looked at the 2008 Flash Barometer, there was 30% of the people who knew about the cohesion funds. Well, it hasn't increased a lot. So I mean, 10% percentage point increase is not a whole lot over a period of more than 10 years. And I think that is also part of that the funding goes mostly to firms in terms of capital subsidies. So I would recommend that, and I would also recommend to strongly integrate the goal of the distribution of welfare, marginalization, social exclusion, and poverty, especially among women and children. I think that is incredibly important. And of course, there are other types of marginalized groups that are also important to certain ethnicities. For example, there's also the intersectionality aspect, which I think is incredibly important in that debate. And I think this debate should be conducted, perhaps not so much in terms of necessarily integrating all of these aspects into regional policy, but to get to a more honest communication about the funds. I think it would be a disappointment if the EU was to continue emphasizing the social goals, despite the practice not having measurable effects over so many years. And the inquiry in my book stops at 2013, but so I cannot say anything evidence-based on over the past 10 years, but arguably we still see persistent poverty and inequality problems. So I think that there needs to be a more honest debate. So yes, I answer your question with these broader reflections, because I think a big debate is also necessary in order to come to more focused, more efficient, and perhaps a bit more honest funding schemes.
Great, thank you very much. You raised something where you stopped analyzing that I want to backload for our last question, how you see things developing now with the crisis reaction, the pandemic reaction, right? So with New Generation EU. But before that, Martijn, can I ask you, do you see any way to bring subjective well-being, so to bring the impact of policies on subjective well-being into a policy reform of such a big machinery as the EU regional spendings?
Well, to start with, yes, but it's part and parcel of a more general well-being approach. So I think subjective well-being can be used, for example, also to see what is important in terms of policy. Do people attach more value to environmental quality? Do people attach more value to inequality? How does inequality harm happiness or life satisfaction? So you should, really use it to look at life outcomes. So how people are experiencing life, and you can then look at different dimensions of objective reality on how that affects people life experiences. And so it can help policymakers in some way also to make decisions where to assign funds to. The whole difficulty with it is like, if you look at subjective well-being, what is important for your subjective well-being is not necessarily important for my subjective well-being. So you should be very careful if using subjective well-being measures as well, because before you can do it, you should thoroughly understand what works for whom under which circumstances. And in that sense, you will always need objective measures next to subjective measures within the whole policy makers making debate. Having said that, and then also we'll be reflecting more broad on Lisa's work, you see that policy evaluation studies are very much warranted, and we don't have enough of these type of studies that look beyond effects on GDP. We should research in that regard also what these policies do with other dimensions of well-being, including the subjective well-being, and what kind of mechanisms are at play, and who is profiting and who's not.
Thank you very much. Absolutely, absolutely. Evidence-based is starting and end point, data starting and end point of all the policy reforms that we actually need to reflect on. We have 1 minute to go, and I have now the speed dating question to you, Lisa, and to you, Martijn. Do you see any differences in how the EU has managed funding with the pandemic? Next Generation EU, the new program lines. Is there something that we could see could merge into a new reform of cohesion programs that we should take and extend in terms of lifetime?
I think one thing that is, no, I have 1 minute, I can focus, perhaps I can go from the substantive question of the funding programs to the implementation side. I think with Next Generation EU and the implementation in the national investment plans, the EU Commission's oversight and capacity has increased. And I think that is a good thing. And I think that needs to be strengthened so that the EU can more forcefully help the member states bring in social goals. But the Commission should also try to initiate this debate also for its own sake and its own reputation and support for the EU in terms of not only promoting growth, but also integrating people's needs into this growth model.
Great. Martijn, a reaction? Because if not, then I do have a very last minute question from the floor from Johanna Kreis.
Please ask the question.
Yeah. Do you think that conditionality of funding could shape a more well-being based policy in the member states?
I think yes. I have struggled with this question a lot, whether conditionality should be sharpened or relaxed. Because if it's relaxed, then the member states could in theory have more bottom-up approaches and take more their time with absorption, and they could tailor the funding more to local needs. But in practice, we don't see this effect. So I feel quite comfortable to say, on the basis of the research that I've done for that book, but also for other projects, I think conditionality is a good thing here because it actually provides hard incentives for member states to conduct or to implement the funds in a specific way, and hopefully in the future with a stronger social focus.
Thanks a lot. Martijn, any reaction from you? Do you want to react on that, or?
I have nothing to add. That's a perfect answer.
Time is already over, but you see how intense and multi-level the discussion about the topic of your book and your book is. So it's not just to understand the implementation issues of EU policies, but it's a more paradigmatic discussion about how we want to see our society and how we actually define the essence of our life on Earth in a way, right? So how well-being can be improved by supranational policies or not, and what issues we face. I can only again congratulate you on the book, which is a very strong empirical and also from the data science perspective, a very strong new approach. I do hope that a lot of policymakers will have it at hand while discussing the reform of the cohesion policy. I thank you both, Lisa and Martijn, for your presence today and for your willingness to discuss. I'll invite you to think about the book's outcome, and spread the word of its existence to policymakers that you are in contact with. And kindly invite you to stay tuned and monitor our events agenda for upcoming book talks and EPRS events. Thank you very much, and thanks to both of you. Great pleasure. Thank you.